Thank you for coming to today's Heal Lunch and Learn talk. My name is Kairos Lobrera, and I am faculty in Keck's Narrative Medicine program, and I also serve as Director of Diversity and Inclusion Programs here at Keck. So the Lunch and Learn series is an initiative of the Humanities, Ethics, Art, and Law program, also known as HEAL, here at Keck. This series recognizes the importance of bringing scholars in the humanities, social sciences, film, theater, and law to support our collective understanding of health of individuals, communities, and societies. We're so pleased today to have Renee Rao. Renee holds an MA in 20th century US history, specializing in women's and gender history. She received her MA from Washington State University, and she also holds a Master of Library and Information Science from San Jose State. She works as an information services librarian at Norris Medical Library and liaisons with the Keck School of Medicine. Her current research interests include graphic medicine, pathways to health sciences librarianship, and reproductive health information. As the project lead, Renee was recently awarded the Collection Equity Grant from the Network of National Library of Science, National Library of Medicine, Region 5. She proposed acquiring graphic medicine titles to bolster the library's collection and jumpstart activities related to narrative medicine and health equity. Materials purchased with this grant are included in NNLM's freely available Diverse Voices in Health and Medicine Collection Development Toolkit. You're all encouraged to visit the Norris Medical Library to view the associated exhibit and check out the graphic novels. I'm sure many of you are into graphic novels. Today, Renee will be talking about, as you can see here from the title, Quacks, Heroes, and Humans, a short history of physicians in comics and cartoons. Let's give a warm welcome to Renee Rao.
So yes, thank you for that welcome. I appreciate it. As mentioned, my name is Renee Rao, and I work just across the quad there at Norris Medical Library. So I'm happy to be talking with all of you today. I guess just to elaborate a little bit more on my position at the library as an information services librarian. And liaison to the Keck School of Medicine. Some of you may have seen me, maybe if you're in some of the incoming classes for the MD program. I was just at the orientation this past summer, or you may have seen me in some other instruction sessions. But I work with Keck School of Medicine. That includes MD program, public health, all the variety of programs. So it's a lot of folks that I'm working with, but you all are great students and faculty to work with. So please feel free to reach out to me about any research questions, library questions. I'd be happy to answer anything from simple access questions to research projects or help familiarize yourself with anything with the library. So that's my little pitch of what I do in my day-to-day realm. As mentioned, I do have an interest in graphic medicine. Obviously, the grant was mentioned earlier. Actually, when I was interning at the Norris Medical Library a couple of years ago, I started a research guide related to the topic. So we do have lots of materials, both physically and electronically at the library. And so this kind of is what spurred my interest in graphic medicine. As I've also said in a lecture I gave for some of the narrative medicine students in a class last spring, I am a self-proclaimed comic book nerd, so I do love comic books in general. But this kind of cross-section of something that I find entertaining, interesting, with kind of my interest in obviously librarianship and history. That was my previous degree before I switched to librarianship. It's a nice cross-section of all the things that I'm kind of interested in. So that's my spiel about my position and kind of how I came to this topic. And so, as given from the title here for Quacks, Heroes and Humans, A Short History of Physicians in Comics and Cartoons, this was kind of my quick title that I made when I was asked to give this talk related to talking about kind of the progression of how physicians have been depicted in popular comics. I use the term cartoons here. I was just clarifying, as I said, this was a very quick title I came up with. I won't be talking about cartoons if you're thinking about like animated cartoons or films or things like that, though that would be also a very interesting topic. Particularly here, I'll be talking about like caricatures and satirical caricatures throughout the rest of the talk. So just to clarify in the terminology. So what I'll be talking about today is I broke it down into three general sections to at least make the narrative a little bit, as we're talking about various narrative a little bit easier to follow along here. So we're going to talk about pre-modern medicine, particularly in Western Europe. We'll talk about 20th century, kind of pre-post-World War II depictions, mostly post-World War II. And then we'll move into talking about contemporary comics and graphic medicine. And then there should be time for questions and answer at the end, or if you just want to chat about maybe things that I didn't mention in the talk that you also find relevant to this presentation. Okay, so here's my kind of preamble, and you may have seen this in some of the advertisements for this particular talk. But this is kind of my very basic thesis statement. If I was to actually write a historical article on this, I'd want it to be much more nuanced than this. But basically saying that within the modern era, physicians have been the subject of satirical cartoons, political cartoons, comic strips, and a variety of other media, right? But kind of there's been this progression as there's been a change in medicine, that there's been a movement from kind of the quack doctor, quack remedies, through post-World War II, where there's very heroic depictions of science and technology and scientists and medical professionals. And then moving forward to graphic medicine at the end here, we'll be talking about kind of the more nuanced depictions within, I would say, the 21st century, and actually having physicians themselves create comics. Okay, so first up, talking about pre-modern medicine. Actually, before I jump into this topic, I did want to just say this presentation, I'm using you all as like my guinea pig audience right now, as I haven't presented this topic before. So this is kind of my chance to play around with this idea and topic, and maybe potentially create this into something longer, maybe do a conference presentation, a paper. So please feel free to give me feedback, advice. Like I said, if there's something you're like, oh, what about this person or this cartoon or something like that, feel free to let me know. But moving into our first section here for pre-modern medicine, so particularly talking about 18th and 19th century caricatures. Sorry, that word's like difficult for me to say. It's like very like hard C sounds. So caricatures, and particularly we're talking about some British illustrators, so it's not going to be every kind of depiction. So I just wanted to give that caveat before I moved into it, because obviously there's been medical illustrations for centuries from different cultures, different communities, that I just wanted to acknowledge that I'll be talking about British white men producing this, and I realize that there are other folks that have also produced medical illustrations, but we'll be talking about kind of the focus in Britain. So particularly, these caricatures are going to be coming up in prints, and so I just wanted to give kind of thinking back to maybe some of your, if you took any history classes during undergrad maybe, or maybe you just have an interest in history, that 18th and 19th century, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied right now. You see an explosion of print materials, so whether that's pamphlets, newsletters, newspapers, flyers going around. You see an explosion during this time with advents of printing press, making printing presses better, that you see a high volume of this circulating. I've heard some historians and podcasters and stuff joke that like this was the internet before the internet, right? This is how folks communicated, whether it was scientific discoveries, radical newspapers, pushing for democracy or things like that. This is where all of these kinds of conversations are happening. So it only makes sense that then any kind of caricatures, illustrations, happenings that are going on within particularly like Western Europe, as we're talking about, makes sense that they would be in this kind of print material. And so these caricatures were often, like I said, satirical, political in nature, and may depict prominent people, significant events within these kinds of materials. So one of the first people I wanted to mention that you'll see often related to these caricatures is William Hogarth. And he was an illustrator, artist, who was a bit of a nationalist, and I forget which college it is at this point, I'm blanking on it, but knew that a college was actually hiring an Italian painter to come and do a mural, and he said, I'll do it for free if you let me do the mural. And so that's kind of how he started working within the medical community with doctors and physicians. So that's how a lot of his work starts to transition towards depicting this. And one of his most famous prints that he created is called The Company of Undertakers. So that's something when you're thinking about themes of these caricatures and what you might be seeing. He often depicted physicians and quack doctors in relation to death. So you'll see a lot of death imagery, right? So you'll see skull and bones. And this particular one, he's kind of making a mock coat of arms here. And actually these three people at the top of the image that you'll see are actually famous quack physicians. So it's kind of interesting because he's inverting the hierarchy where the quack physicians are at the top of this pyramid, while the actual physicians are lower down. And there's a few within here who actually were famous physicians in London at the time. And you'll notice they have their canes. And something I didn't realize till looking at this, a lot of canes actually had like sniffing, like things that smelled good, right? If you think about like plague doctor masks where they would have like some kind of potpourri in there to make it smell better, apparently a lot of canes would have this at the top. So they're sniffing their cane to like avoid the stench of death and decay. And so he's famous for this kind of depiction of kind of all these men in their large wigs trying to avoid the stench of death while they're surrounded by death. Another famous image, this is the last part of a 4-part series of engravings. So for here it says 4 stages of cruelty, the reward of cruelty. So in this particular series, I don't have the whole thing shown here, the person who is the middle of this table is named Tom Nero, and he starts a life of crime as the earlier depictions of him as beginning his criminal life. He's torturing animals, doing other like terrible things, progresses to the point where he's hanged for murder, and then now we see the result after being hung for murder, where we now have the doctors who are dissecting him for scientific reasons. But you'll see here that there's some kind of lofty people kind of just overlooking this. Obviously some gruesome things happening on the table. There's a dog there eating like remains from him. So it's a kind of gruesome outcome to a bad life, is the morality of this tale. We can complicate that and talk more about who's being committed, who's being criticized within this, usually poorer classes, and those kinds of things. But this is one of his most famous engravings here. So another famous illustrator you'll hear talked about related to this is James Gilray. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And so his most famous depiction is probably this one here, the Gout from 1799. He actually suffered from gout, so he often depicts people with gout in a variety of caricatures. And so this one, obviously here, he's depicting gout as having like a little demon on your foot and kind of the pain that's associated with it, and then has kind of this, bulbous, red, not great looking foot there. And so this is probably his most famous one. But he's also known for depicting kind of quack remedies and quack doctors. And so whereas maybe Hogarth's has a lot more like death imagery related to it, his has a lot more related to weird things that people were doing at the time. And so in this particular one, it's called the metallic tractors from 1801. And this was kind of riffing off the craze that was happening in England at the time, based off these things called Perkins tractors from a woman named Alicia Perkins from the US, actually. So it's an imported quack remedy to England. And basically, from what I can understand, it's like these metallic rods that you would like stick into your face and other places, and it was supposed to cure everything. So this zoomed in shot, I'm sure for folks in the back you can't read it there, but things like it cures all kinds of disorders, cures red noses that you might get from like alcoholism or something, cures gouty toes, windy bowels, humpbacks. So it cures anything and everything, right? And so here we have this kind of silly looking figures who one's getting this applied to him, his wig's falling off. But you also notice that there's also a variety of like vices that are around. So he has wine on the table, brandy. There's a picture in the back that's like a little like Bacchus. So clearly this gentleman's been indulging in some various vices. So it's kind of a critique also on that, as well as having this kind of treatment applied. So third gentleman I'll be talking about here is Thomas Rowlandson. And he's, again, in the same time period as these other folks that are creating satirical caricatures. And so here's one of his famous ones called Amputation. And you'll notice here, if you're able to look at some of the faces here, they're a bit ghoulish and interested. You'll notice that the gentleman getting an amputation is clearly not sedated at all of any kind. He seems very upset. And that there's no tourniquets or anything applied, seemingly healthy leg that they're sawing off. And the bag on the ground has a variety of implements falling out as well as a variety of bones. And actually I was zoomed in on this like sign in the back, and he has a variety of ridiculous names for the doctors. So like I know one of them was like Paul Puke, and another one was like Purge and Sawbones, and so all these kinds of things that might be applied to you or done to you to cure your ailments. But yes, so they're all kind of grotesque doctors applying this supposed treatment to the patient. Here's another one. This one's actually kind of a work in progress, and so the title here we have is Death as an Apothecary's Assistant, making up medicines with a mortar and pestle for apothecary attending a female patient who sits by the fireside. This is a watercolor, and it's not sure if it's attributed to actually Rowlandson or potentially someone else that he worked with or was training. But as you can see here, this is kind of also a critique of apothecaries. So in kind of that hierarchy of the medical establishment at the time, you would have physicians, you'd have apothecaries underneath, obviously a variety of precursors to pharmaceuticals. And so the critique there is that, you might be you're sick, and obviously you're trying to find any remedy that will treat whatever ails you, including potentially a remedy brewed by death itself. So that's a lot of imagery within his work has critiques of apothecaries and remedies. So moving on to 20th century, so a big jump in time here. I'm sure there's a variety of other depictions within that, but I figure we'll move the timeline forward to the 20th century. Obviously, we're talking about caricatures before, so these are mostly going to be single prints of one kind of scene that's happening. And as we move to the 20th century, we're getting more of what you might actually see as comics or what you see in graphic novels now. And so the one thing to note is that as we move towards comics, you're getting more sequential art, right? So you're seeing small different scenes that put together make up a story. And you're also seeing that combination of the narrative with art. So you'll see, obviously speech bubbles, thought bubbles, but it's creating a narrative rather than just a scene. So that's something to think about as a change. And one thing I wanted to bring up at this point too is, why Why comics and why not something else? Comics are a mass media that everyday people read. It's not something that's necessarily like highbrow, often been looked down upon in the past. That's changed in recent decades, and obviously super popular with things like Marvel Universe and DC and all that kind of thing. But in previous decades, probably wouldn't be something that I would be talking to you about in a lecture hall at USC. Maybe, maybe not. So they're approachable. They do provide an emotional connection and impact. So part of that discussion within comic studies related to that sequential art and creating that narrative, as I mentioned, is that you actually have to build the narrative yourself as you're reading it, that you're actually participating in the construction of the story, because you have to understand, okay, what action is happening in this panel, what's the dialogue telling me, and so it can really have this more emotional impact than you might get from something else, actually. And then just like with our caricatures previously, it can help express an alternate viewpoint because it gives you a different medium to express yourself in that. So I have a few examples here for 20th century. So my one pre-World War II example, and again, I'm sure there's plenty of other ones, but just don't have time for this particular talk, is Dreams of Rarebit Fiend. So I had to look this up because also, again, I am not British, or from the UK, so I didn't know what this was. Apparently, it's basically eating cheese on toast. So if you eat cheese on toast, the lore goes that you will have weird dreams that night. And so this whole range from this cartoonist Winsor McCay is very dream sequences that are very strange because supposedly these people are eating cheese on toast before bedtime. And some of these do depict doctors. So there's one where a woman comes in with an ailment, and rather than treating it, they say like, oh, water it and you'll grow something from it, right? And so it's weird, like harvest season based on this woman's disease. So that one has some very interesting kind of trippy things that you might see. But moving into my other three examples, these are all going to be post-World War II or just about post-World War II. And you're seeing more depictions of physicians as heroes. So in particular, you'll notice that for Rex Morgan, MD, this character created by a psychiatrist is actually a doctor. So the whole premise is that he's a doctor, and he comes into these various situations and faces ethical dilemmas. So I know one of the first ones is that I think it might even actually be the issue that's pictured here, is that the nurse wants to euthanize this patient, and he comes in and says, no, we can't do that, I can save her. So it's very savior complex coming in to rescue patients. The other two, which I guess are a bit more unique, and as we're talking, as I mentioned, Marvel and DC Comics earlier, we have some kind of superhero depictions. So this first one here was a new one to me called Dr. Midnight. This is from All American Comics, which to my knowledge doesn't exist anymore. But it was introduced in 1941. And the character, Dr. Charles McNider, is a heroic doctor who helps any patient, lives by the code that he should help when he can. And so how he becomes a crime-fighting superhero is that he saves a witness that was injured by the mob, but then the mob comes after him, and he loses his sight. Doctors do all they can for him, but he loses his sight. But notices one night when an owl flies into his room that he can actually see in the dark, and that's his power. And that he starts to fight crime that way. I think we all know why he's probably not a popular character anymore. So that one's an interesting one, and I'll be interested to see if I can find any actual panels of that one. And then, of course, Doctor Strange. I'm sure many of you have heard that name floating around due to recent Marvel movies and comics. But he actually debuts in 1963, and while the emphasis is on the strange and the occult and him doing magic, if you're aware of the character, the whole premise is that he's kind of an egotistical doctor who's a famous surgeon, but then gets into a car accident and damages his hands and can no longer perform surgeries, and so his journey into the occult to prepare his hands and then ultimately become a sorcerer. So again, kind of emphasis is on the strange aspect of it, but in certain runs of this character, you will see him leaning on his morals as a doctor to do the least amount of damage. So in one of the famous arcs from Civil War, which is a recent comic book run from last decade or two, he kind of becomes a moderator and a negotiator between these two different sides of superheroes because he wants to do the least amount of damage to the world. So he feels that if he settles the issue, he'll save the most people. So something interesting that happens right after World War II is the introduction kind of these true or real comics. So rather than where those ones were kind of fantastical, superhero based, which is the most popular at the time, you do also have these kind of historical in nature comics. So on the left here, I have depicted, this is actually from an inaugural issue that starts to include this Wonder Woman of history. So this is actually within the Wonder Woman comic. You'd have Wonder Woman's story, and then at the end of the issue, you'd also get a brief story about historical Wonder Woman. And so for the inaugural one, it features Florence Nightingale, and that was in 1942. So kind of celebrating, the real history and showing her and other women as heroic in these kinds of professions. And then on the right, we have an example called Walter Reed, the Man Who Conquered Yellow Fever. So this is actually from Science Comics, which again is something I hadn't heard of before, but the whole premise is all of these are science-based comics and really kind of advertising the heroic nature of the field. Part of it's encouraging children to want to go into science and medical fields. And this one is particularly in 1946, and there's a variety of other ones where, again, it's depicting kind of, Marie Curie, Louis Pasteur, like various people where it's like, wow, look at this great discovery, and advertising that kind of towards a younger audience. Okay, so have a little bit more time to talk here, and then hopefully you'll have some questions or comments at the end. But moving into part 3 here, I have my little progression here from the Quacks heroes to multidimensional humans. So as we were talking about Quacks and kind of critiquing kind of where medicine was at in 18th and 19th century, those heroes, celebrating their profession, celebrating all these great discoveries. And then now moving more towards 21st century of more multidimensional depictions as you all are working towards being physicians, I assume, or related to the healthcare field. And while you are your job, you're also a whole human being with other things and thoughts going on in your lives. And so I feel like this is now where we're trending with a lot of depictions. And so in particular, I wanted to mention graphic medicine as mentioned at the top of this presentation. That is kind of my area of interest within librarianship right now, and so highlighting it here for all of you. But I like this definition from the National Library of Medicine, which says, graphic medicine is the use of comics to tell personal stories of illness and health. And so this is a newer terminology, graphic medicine. It refers to, graphic novels or comics, but particularly with an emphasis on that personal narrative related to illness and health. So there's probably more that were coming out before the last decade or 15 years, but you'll really see this terminology used within the last decade or so. Another definition to think about would be graphic medicine is a field that explores and supports the interaction between the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare. This one's a little bit uses more highbrow words within it, which is why I like the National Library of Medicine one, because I feel it's a little bit more direct. But again, this is from Dr. Ian Williams, who's kind of a well-known figure within graphic medicine, and again, thinking about that medium of comics with either, here it's saying discourse of healthcare, but talking about, whether it's the healthcare industry, physician point of view, patient point of view, maybe it's a caregiver point of view. So for all of the kind of perspectives that you might have on healthcare. So a couple titles I wanted to mention in relation to this that I would say are probably more well-known within graphic medicine. As mentioned in the previous slide, Dr. Ian Williams is kind of at the forefront of this particular terminology. He's cited as the person to first use that terminology, and since then it's been in common usage. But he produced this book in 2014, excuse me, called The Bad Doctor, The Troubled Life and Times of Dr. Ian James. And in this, you have kind of a small town doctor in rural UK who's dealing with, the hardships of running a clinic, the weird patients that come in and out, right? But then also his personal side of it, where he's dealing with OCD. So you have both of those dualities, and showing what he's dealing with and maybe hasn't really confronted before, or hasn't felt like he can confront as a physician, and talks about how his OCD manifests. And then another popular one is Taking Turns, stories from HIV/AIDS Care Unit 371. I'm not going to try to pronounce her last name. I'm not great with Eastern European names. I apologize. But she goes by the colloquially comic nurse. And in this one, it's her memoir, basically, of her being on that care unit during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Or actually, I don't even know if it's during that epidemic. It might be later than that. But basically, she started drawing comics as a way to express herself and deal with losing patients, the hard times that she was having. She started doing it for herself, and she started sharing it with people, and then was able to produce this work. And then she does a lot of narrative medicine and graphic medicine related work right now. And then the other one I wanted to mention here is Graphic Medicine Manifesto. And so there's a variety of authors on this book, but basically they've all written a variety of essays within it. Some are proper text essays, and other ones are actual comic depictions of whatever they're talking about. But this is kind of, as it states from using the terminology manifesto, is kind of their statement about what graphic medicine is, what it could be, why it's important, and all of those kinds of things. So definitely recommend that one if you're interested in learning more about the topic. And then, so we have graphic medicine, and that's, like I said, kind of graphic novels. A lot of those are produced by bigger presses, or even academic presses, like University of Pennsylvania produces a lot of graphic medicine titles. And then there's smaller indie presses that produce those as well. But then obviously one way that, as we're talking about kind of proliferation of information with those periodicals and newsletters before, obviously with the internet, there's a wide range of ways to share anything that you want on the internet, right? And so some of that is webcomics, and I'm sure you'll see this in relation to other kinds of topics. There's all kinds of popular webcomics out there, but here I wanted to mention that something interesting I've started seeing in a lot of newspapers is actually having op-eds and other articles written out or produced within a comic format. So this particular op-ed from Nathan Gray was in the Los Angeles Times, and the whole series and his critique and kind of dealing with the emotions of taking care of patients during COVID, especially kind of peak pandemic times. So he wrote his whole op-ed as a comic, which I thought was really interesting, and using kind of this metaphor of purgatory and being chained basically to the walls of the hospital for these patients that weren't able to leave intensive care units. And he has several other kind of op-eds all done in this manner. And so that's something interesting, I guess, for me to start seeing, is more of these within actual newspapers. And then of course, there's been a huge boom within just using things like social media or Instagram, as pictured in this case, of people just sharing their work of what they're producing. So this particular one, the handle is Shirley Worrell, MD. Her Dr. Shirlene Obiobi, oh shoot, I'm gonna mess up her name, I apologize. She is a cardiology resident fellow in, I think, University of Chicago, somewhere in Chicago. And she has her Instagram here where she posts a variety of things, but in particular she posts her comics related to things that she's dealing with So you probably can't see the text all the way back there, or even on the screen potentially. But basically, in this 4-piece panel, she's talking with her patient, explaining why he's having trouble breathing, checking with him to make sure he understands what's happening. And he says, "Great, thank you. But this thing keeps beeping. Can you help me with it?" And she mentions in the caption of this that she's like, "I can do all of these fabulous things, and I can repair this, repair that. Ask me about a monitor. I have no idea how to fix it. I need to call a nurse." And so she throws a smoke screen and vanishes, and somehow he's gotten the call button to call the nurse to come and fix that, right? So kind of admitting that being like, I can do a lot of great things, there are certain things I can't do. And so she has a lot of work related to that kind of thought or burnout or dealing with being like a woman of color in medicine. So I highly recommend checking out her Instagram for her comics. And then I just want to round out the presentation with a little bit of shameless self-promotion, that this is my graphic medicine research guide that you can find on our library website. But basically on there, I have a bunch of titles and materials listed, and some of them are going to be available physically, some of them are going to be available in ebook form, and it's all listed there. So if there's something a topic you're interested in, you can find it there. Or, as mentioned, you can stop by the Norris Medical Library and check out any of our material. I know some people see them on display and they think like they can't take them or touch them, but you're more than welcome to check out as many as you'd like. Here's my reference slide, just so you know that there are references. And that'll be my conclusion here. So I do have my information here if you'd like to email me. You can feel free to call or text. And then we have our own Instagram handle if you'd like to follow that if you haven't already. We are trying to start posting on there more. We just had a fun scavenger hunt where some folks won some swag bags. So we're hoping to do more things like that and then just share what's going on with the library. And then my LinkedIn is right there as well, so if you're interested in requesting me on LinkedIn, feel free. But thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.